제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 회복 탄력적 공급망 재편을 위한 한아세안 파트너십의 미래 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번입니다. 감사합니다. 그럼 이번 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해드리겠습니다. 이번 세션의 좌장을 맡아주신 김성환 이사장님입니다. 이사장님께서는 전 외교통상부 장관을 역임하셨으며 현재 동아시아재단 이사장직을 맡고 계십니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for the future of the R.O.K. ASEAN partnership for building a resilient supply chain. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now I would like to hand over the stage to Kim Song-han, Chairman of East Asia Foundation, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome Chairman Kim Song-han.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session, and I would like to express my warm welcome to all of you, and including our panels. And as we are witnessing more than 2 years after COVID-19 crisis, the supply chain turmoil still continues. As the geopolitical factors such as US-China rivalry and Russia's invasion into Ukraine increased risks of supply chain disruption, securing resilient supply chains has become central agenda of the nations, and many countries started to regard supply chain issue as the matter of national security. As some scholar says, paradigm in supply chain is shifting from just in time to just in case. So in the Asian Pacific, US-China strategic competition is being intensified. US launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, in May. And in response to IPEF, China is making efforts to promote RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and applied for joining Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. Under these circumstances, ASEAN is emerging as the new base for supply, and ASEAN's strategic importance in supply chain is being enhanced. So in this session, we'll examine how to secure resilient and robust supply chain in the Asian Pacific region in the midst of US-China rivalry, and how to promote cooperation between Korea and ASEAN from the perspective of supply chain. So today, we have very distinctive and outstanding 4 panels. From my left side, Dr. Yoo Myung-hee, she was the former Trade Minister of Korea, and I remember that she was the first female Trade Minister of Korea. And during her term as Trade Minister, she strengthened the Korea FTA network, in particular with ASEAN. She concluded the RCEP, and she concluded the economic partnership agreement with Indonesia and also Cambodia, and she launched Korea-Philippine FTA negotiations. Now, she is working as the Ambassador for Economy and Trade, and advise and assist the government in developing and implementing international economic and trade policies. And then Ambassador Kim Chang-bom, he was the Korean ambassador to Indonesia, and also he was ambassador to European Union and Belgium. And now he is currently working as an advisor to the newly established Center for Strategic and Cultural Studies, CSCS. He is working as the standing advisor there. And now Minister Lembong is participating online, and Minister Lembong is the former Trade Minister of Indonesia, and he was also the chairman of Investment Coordinating Board. And prior to serving in President Jokowi's cabinet, Minister Lembong spent his career in finance, starting with Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank. Now he's working as on the International Advisory Council of the Institute for International Strategic Studies in London, and also he's working as the chairman of the board of PT Jaya Akol. And he also set up Consilience Policy Institute in Singapore. And lastly, but not the least, Dr. Deborah Ames. She is the founder and the executive director of the Asia Trade Center, and she is the president of the Asia Business Trade Association. And concurrently, she is a member of R.O.K's International Advisory Council, and she is also research associate at the New Zealand APEC Study Center and the senior fellow of the Ministry of Trade and the Industry Academy of Singapore. So please welcome all our panelists. So I will start this session with questions on IPEF. And first, I will talk with our panelists, and if time permits, then I will get some question and session from the floor. So my first question goes to Dr. Adams and Ambassador Kim. As I already mentioned, IPF started, and last week, ministers from 14 countries met together in Los Angeles, and they agreed to start negotiation on rules and regulation of IPF. So still, IPF is in the process of making. So, but some critics of IPF says that it should go beyond challenging China's influence and produce a functional economic bloc that will benefit all the participating countries. So in this regard, Dr. Adams and Ambassador Kim, how do you see the future of IPF? So, Dr. Adams, yeah.
Okay, that's a tough question right out of the beginning. Okay, so the first thing I would say on IPEF, which is super important, is that this is not a trade agreement. Okay, it does not look like RCEP, it does not look like CPTPP, it is not a trade agreement. It's a framework, and you have to keep that in your head, otherwise you will inevitably, I think, be disappointed in IPEF, because it's trying to do the same kinds of things. So what IPEF has is an unusual structure. It has 4 pillars in there, and most of the 4 pillars are not about changing the rules for today, as much as I think it is about setting potential coordination up for the future. So think of IPEF as a framework to ensure that members are moving in the same general direction on topics of interest to IPEF. So what does that look like? Well, let me show you the clearest example of this. There's a pillar on tax and anti-corruption. And most of what's in that pillar is a commitment to follow whatever commitments you made someplace else. So we're not making new commitments necessarily in IPEF. We're just agreeing we did this in the past, we agreed to it in the past, we will do it again in the future. So that is not how all of the pillars will be, but that's how one pillar will be. So it shows you how different this is. We're not making a long hundreds of pages of rules. There's no legally binding dispute settlement attached to most of it. It is really new territory. And so that makes it, I think, very hard to assess how successful it will be, because it's brand new and we've never tried something like this before. So it could be spectacular, or it could be another sort of, conversation that we have, which is nice. I mean, I think we would all agree conversation is great. We should have it. But in terms of delivering meaningful benefits, I think we have to wait and see. And particularly if we talk about economic, deliverables for companies and the development of rules that benefit companies, I think there we really have to wait and see. Because most of what they're discussing is not what we normally discuss when we talk about integration. There's nothing on goods, services, investment, intellectual property rights. Most of what we do in a trade agreement is not there. It's about some discussion, digital, labor, environment, supply chains, what's an essential good, tax, these kinds of issues which are perhaps very important but not typical in a trade deal.
Thank you. I think now our audience has a clear picture on IPEF. How about you, Ambassador Kim?
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Before responding to the question, let me extend my warmest gratitude to the organizer, East Asia Foundation, and Minister Kim, and all the staff that have been working hard to organize this. And I think that Dr. Adams has very eloquently just put forth kind of the general picture of what IPEF would be like. As was emphasized by Dr. Adams, it is still at an early stage. It is an evolving process. It is not the usual type of free trade agreement. And just last week, the first ever in-person IPEF ministerial meeting was convened in Los Angeles, United States. It's the first ever, even though there were some virtual meetings. So it is only a beginning of the whole process. They have agreed on some of the outlines of negotiation objectives that will be followed up by the further discussions and consultation hopefully for the next year or two. Of course, the US administration is setting a target to be aimed at finishing up general principles agreement sometime by fall next year when US will be hosting APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Leaders Meeting in the United States. So we have about 1 year, a timeline that is ahead of us, but there are some elements that we have to take into account when we are looking at this IPEF. The first one is there are some expectation gaps. Maybe not some, quite significant in a sense. I don't know, some might disagree with my observation, but there is a significant gap of expectation and also kind of lack of commonness in priorities and interest. Expectation gap especially lies in the discrepancies of their expectation between the United States and partners who belong to emerging economies. Because the emerging economies, including ASEAN countries, there are 7 countries out of 10 ASEAN member states who have joined this IPEF, but they are more concerned, more focused on trade side. Of course, US has not given any hint that they will be giving any kind of the incentive or the market access facilities through this IPEF negotiation. But still there are some hopes on the part of the ASEAN countries and other emerging economies to have some kind of market access benefits. And the second thing is that there are still some lingering concerns among emerging economies, especially within ASEAN countries, that this mechanism might be only an economic wing or economic leverage that will be exercised by the United States upon emerging economies like ASEAN. And also, it might be another kind of the US projection of their interest through economic and trade means. So those are the things that we might have to consider while we are looking at this whole evolving process of IPEF.
Thank you. We can feel that through these two answers. You can feel that still there are expectations and worries as well. So my next question is a kind of follow-up to this question, and Minister Yu and Minister Rembong, because both of you participated in the RCEP negotiation. Now China is promoting RCEP, US is launching IPF. So do you think these two, IPF and RCEP, can be compatible? Minister Yu first, and then Minister Rembong.
Thank you. As this is my first intervention, I would also like to express my thanks to the the organizer and Minister Kim for organizing this meaningful event on this very pertinent topic of supply chain resilience and Korea-ASEAN cooperation on this topic. Well, regarding whether this IPEF and RCEP can be compatible, yes, I think this RCEP and IPF can be compatible and can also complement each other. First, this IPEF can address some of the elements that RCEP has not addressed before, especially supply chain resilience, which are very necessary in this very unpredictable and uncertain times. Let me further elaborate on this. First of all, RCEP is very significant mega FTA in the region, and RCEP is an initiative which was driven by ASEAN, which is very, ASEAN-centered trade agreement. As someone who participated in the RCEP negotiations as Korea's chief negotiator and also signed the document as Korea's trade minister, I believe that RCEP can accelerate the flow of goods, inputs, and investment in the region, and can also help companies build supply chains that leverage different advantages and skills across the ASEAN region. However, most of the RCEP agreements were actually concluded before COVID-19. I would say 99% of the agreements, except for some technical and legal scrubbing issues, most of them were already concluded before COVID-19. So when I was at the negotiation table, supply chain resilience was not even an issue at that time. So RCEP text has not addressed the issue of supply chains, but nowadays our business are faced with different realities and different challenges. As Minister Kim mentioned, they are faced with the different factors of growing political tensions and strategic rivalry between US and China, as well as COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and most recently China's zero COVID-19 policy. All these factors wreak havoc on supply chain policies. Having said that, this has made companies and governments rethink and reconfigure supply chain issues, and IPEF can address those supply chain resilience issues, and RCEP can also provide market access to the region in terms of goods, services, and investments. In that way, they can complement each other and can be compatible. Having said that, as both of the previous panelists mentioned, we still don't know the future of the IPEF, and I do hope that IPEF can be developed into lasting, durable, implementable, and mutually beneficial framework, because we also need IPEF-type cooperation framework that can address 21st century economic challenges that our businesses are faced with.
Thank you.
Up here,
I'm a bit relieved to hear from Minister Yu. If IPEF and RCEP can be complementary, that is what we are looking for. But what about you? Minister Rembong, do you agree with this view? can you tell us your view?
Thank you, Minister Kim. And certainly I want to join my fellow panelists in conveying my heartfelt appreciation also to the organizers and to yourself, Minister Kim, for the kind invitation for me to participate. I really wish I was able to be there in person, but I'm glad I'm able to at least participate via online. Personally, I strongly welcome the initiation of the IPEF. I personally feel that it's arguably the only game in town now in terms of effort at large scale, multilateral trade discussion. And Dr. Helms just now emphasized that this is not a trade agreement. It's more like a trade discussion. Nevertheless, I do think that it's the best we can do right now, given the reality of domestic politics in the United States, for example, where both parties, as far as I understand, and Dr. Helms can go deeper into this, yeah, but as far as I understand, there's minimal support, both among the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, for trade liberalization. Yeah. So I think the IPEF reflects what America is able to do right now. But if I may build on the comments from my fellow panelists just now, I do agree with Minister Yu that that RCEP and IPEF can be compatible. Yeah. And actually, to me, the point that resonates more with me, even more, from Minister Yu just now is the world has changed so dramatically since RCEP. And so we do need something new. Like, we do need to sit together again for new consensus on new issues, which were completely absent during the time of RCEP. I would like to remind us that RCEP was initiated in 2011, but launched only in 2012. And looking back at that now, it feels like an eternity ago. It feels like a different era, right? However, what's going to be very interesting to refer to Ambassador Kim Chang-byom's comment just now, that there's still a bit of suspicion, right? Because the agenda under IPF is very, very Western, very American, even arguably. There's, for example, focus on anti-corruption and on minimizing tax evasion and tax arbitrage, which I think is not, so prevalent or so prominent in other trade agreements such as RCEP or even, I would argue, CPTPP. Yeah, so this is sort of a new arena of perhaps Washington trying to corral all of us towards the kind of a consensus that anti-corruption is important, that this should be a core issue. Now, and I will stop my intervention shortly, but I would like to conclude this intervention by saying, I think what's going to be really key ultimately is actually sincerity. Yeah. So the more the US, in having initiated this and leading this, can take a genuine interest in the welfare and the benefit of its counterparties. Yeah. So the more this is aimed at solving real problems for real people, generating concrete benefits for people in ASEAN countries like Indonesia, and if collectively we can link progress under IPEF to new benefits, new improvements that are very concrete to our voters, like the better the prospects for the success of this IPEF. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think all of us will hope for improving lives in ASEAN countries through this IPF and RCEP. And as all our panelists mentioned, this supply chain issue is quite a new issue. And even Korean government, when they announced will join IPEF, the key reason is we want to have a resilient supply chain. And so, Ambassador Kim, I mean, as you know, our dependence of trade on China is very high. So do you believe that IPF will be of help in reducing our dependence on China in terms of supply chain? And if we want to use this IPF to have robust and resilient supply chain, then what will be the best stretch to use this IPF?
That's really a tough question. I think that's I'm
making tough questions.
Yeah, I'm surrounded by the quite renowned trade experts. From my right is Minister of Trade, and another Asian trade expert based in Singapore, and then online there's my dear friend Tom Lembong, former Trade Minister of Indonesia. I think that's Minister Kim's kind of very pointed question even touches upon geopolitical kind of the dimension of this whole the trade dynamism. I think there's I could rephrase the question. That's whether this IPEF, especially a pillar dedicated to robust and resilient supply chain, that will be enhancing the kind of the capacity or the ability of those member states, IPEF partner countries, to have more stable and robust and resilient supply chain networks. That's the aim, actually. That's why the United States has included in that IPEF as one of the key 4 pillars, the supply chain issue. My answer is yes, of course, there's something that we have to work on, but whether that would be really reducing our dependence on the part of the South Korea, dependence on China, I'm still a bit doubtful. Well, that's, we may be hoping for some kind of the diversification of our sources of supplies and much more balanced way of having the China as a market and also supplier, but still it's not fully dependent on that. But this IPEF, as we have discussed in the opening, it is not binding as of now. Of course, it may aim to be more binding and more lasting, but still it's an evolving process, and the negotiation has just started. And the supply chain issue, there are some limitations on the part of the public sector, because supply chain issue arise from the very essence of private sector activities. So without well-coordinated kind of the approach by both the private sector and public sector, we may not be able to achieve very little. So I think there's one example is that there's just very recent one is that we have seen this newly passed Inflation Reduction Act in the United States Biden administration, and together with the leadership of both House and the Senate, have worked on this Inflation Reduction Act that has, at the end of the day, favored the electric vehicles produced only in North America and extending and granting tax credits for those products, those electric vehicles made in North America. That is clearly not fair. It's not giving any level playing field. It does not give us any kind of the comfort when we talk about the cooperation in supply chain with the United States. So I think this, from the private sector's viewpoint, I think this is one example, which is a very recent one, is clearly demonstrating to us that there are some limitations and even sometimes incongruence, not fully kind of consistency exists between this, some of the actions or measures taken by the public sector and the desire and yearning of the private sector players. So I will stop here, and then maybe there must be some more inputs from our trade experts.
Just Mr. Kim mentioned, I agree with you that U.S., they have to be thinking of how to give mutual benefit, not just benefit for America, but benefit for participating countries as well. So this IRA, that act doesn't give a good sign to this IPF process. Minister Lembong, as I said, Korean government, when they announced joining this IPF, they mentioned the supply chain. So what is the expectation from Indonesia joining IPF?
Thank you, Mr. Kim. The current president of Indonesia, President Jokowi, is always extremely focused on investment, particularly inbound investment. And he certainly sees the desire on the part of many or even most countries to diversify their supply chains as an opportunity to attract investment. I think that's number one. I think Indonesia doesn't want to miss out on any possible factory investment as a result of the reallocation of such factory investment away from China and towards other regions. Number two, Indonesia, fortunately, has a booming digital economy and a vibrant startup sector with more than 20 so-called unicorns or startups valued at more than $1 billion. And so digital economy is incredibly important to Indonesia. I often like to call it our most important new growth engine driving economic growth these days. And so to the extent that we need to engage with IPEF, particularly the USA, on things like data policy, cybersecurity, freedom of flows of information and data and connectivity, that will be very important for us, specifically on our digital economy and our ability to continue a thriving, flourishing ecosystem of technology companies and startups.
Thank you. And it's amazing to hear that you have more than 20 unicorns and your digital economy is booming. So that's clear, why we can understand why Indonesia joined the IPEF. Nowadays, Korea's trade with ASEAN is increasing and increasing. So in our country, as you can imagine, there is a big debate how to reduce our dependence on China. And because we experienced kind of a urea case, we import from China most of urea. So if China stops exporting, then what should we do? So nowadays, as our trade with ASEAN is growing, ASEAN is appearing as a kind of alternative supply base. So, Mr. Yu, so do you think ASEAN can be a kind of alternative supply base for Korea?
Yeah. Maybe before I answer that question, I'd like to just briefly touch upon the ASEAN's status in the global economy, as well as global supply chains, because I've worked with ASEAN for so many years. Actually, when I visited ASEAN, some people say that I even look like ASEAN. ASEAN really in the region represents one of the world's really most important growth markets. With its population of 670 million people, and actually more than 2/3 of them are working age, young people, and also it has the GDP of 3.6 million, but it also has really low-cost labor force, as well as well-established manufacturing clusters, including electronics in Malaysia, as well as Vietnam, and also petrochemicals in Indonesia, and recently EVs, electric vehicles in Indonesia, as well as in high-tech areas and R&D areas in Singapore, across the region. So Korea and ASEAN have a lot of areas to further cooperate, further enhance our cooperation on. Having said that, I would like to make a couple of points on your question. But in spite of all those potentials, and I would say that it is not perhaps feasible or realistic to replace China overnight with another countries as alternative supply chain base or alternative markets. China is Korea's largest trading partner. I believe China is also ASEAN's largest trading partner as well. Korea's trade dependence on China is 25%, and I believe ASEAN's trade dependence on China is over 20%. So both of us, our trade are quite heavily dependent on China. So we cannot just stop relying on China overnight. So depending on the individual characteristics of industry or products and company, we perhaps continue to make use of most of this trade with China. But having said that, now I would like to also make my second point. But this 20 to 25% trade dependence on a single country is a risk, especially in these times of supply chain volatility and uncertainty, especially if you conduct a product by product extensive supply chain review. Some of the products you might find like the 80% dependence or 90% dependence. That is the case of urea. Minister Kim mentioned, more than 90% dependence on China. So when China imposed some export restrictions on coal because of their domestic circumstances, Korea's delivery trucks had to stop because they couldn't get that particular material. That could happen anytime due to a variety of reasons. It could be COVID-19 pandemic, or it could be natural disaster or geopolitical reasons. In these times of uncertainty, unpredictability, that could happen anytime. Given that, because of that, these days companies and governments, they are reassessing and reconfiguring their supply chains. And I believe ASEAN is well positioned to capitalize on these supply chain shifts from supply chain efficiency, supply chain resilience. And also in this process, Korea and ASEAN can be the most suitable partner in building resilient supply chains and make our supply chains reliable, secure, and resilient. And let me give you another example, not the urea case, but also a wiring harness case. When the first COVID outbreak, hit the supply chains, disrupted the supply chains in China more than 2.5 years ago, wiring harness is not a very difficult product or very tech-savvy product, but because we couldn't get the product, we highly depended on China regarding that product. But because we couldn't get the product from China because of China's lockdown policy, our Hyundai Automobile Company in Korea had to suspend their production. And at that time, we were only able to resume the production thanks to import of the products from Cambodia. So several months later, when I was trade minister, we launched the FTA negotiations with Cambodia that year. And the next year, we concluded FTA negotiations with Cambodia. And supply chain diversification was one of the reasons to launch the FTA negotiations with Cambodia. So we could build many more supply chain diversification success stories with ASEAN. So I wouldn't say that ASEAN could replace China overnight. Both of us could still use China as our market, as our supply chain base, but both of us could be a good partner, the most suitable partner in diversifying our supply chains and making our supply chain more resilient and more reliable and secure. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Yu. And I think, I agree with you that we cannot replace China overnight with ASEAN. But as we are concerned about our high dependence, so we need to make continuous efforts to reduce it. So in this regard, Dr. Adams, do you think this ASEAN can be, alternative supply base for Korea, and can you estimate ASEAN's capability as a whole, as a new supply base? Because not only Korea, many countries are now looking at ASEAN for new supply base. And I remember that World Economic Forum this year, many people predicted that from global supply chain, it will shift to regional supply chain. And in that case, ASEAN will play kind of major role as a major supplier there. So you have lived there for a long time, and you visited all the countries there. So how do you see the capability of ASEAN?
Well,
in detail, please. Yeah.
There's lots of potential. And there are places that are very successful. But what ASEAN lacks, and has lacked for a long time, I think, is the sort of integrated capability and the ecosystem that you need in order to actually be competitive in many of these products. So it's not just being able to produce the thing, it's being able to get a box to put the thing in, and a label that goes on the box, and a truck that picks up the box and goes to the port efficiently, and a logistics infrastructure that takes the box to where it needs to go in relatively short order. That's the challenge that ASEAN continues to face, I think, which is even if we can produce the thing or the service attached to it, the movement and the ecosystem necessary to be really integrated in many of these supply chains and be an actual competitor to many Chinese supply chains is still missing. There's that gap that's sort of missing. But if I were to give three suggestions for Korea on what could you do to help supply chains, the first one would be, let's implement RCEP. Because if you think about what do firms need, they need access on goods, services, investment. They need their ideas protected. They need digital rules. They need trade facilitation and customs rules. All of that is in RCEP. So job one, let's make sure it gets implemented here and in all of the markets that are attached to RCEP. And I think Korea has the potential to play a leading role in driving some of that implementation focus. You have lots of aid projects, capacity building projects. I think you could have public-private partnerships to deliver results. I think you could do really amazing things on RCEP implementation. The second thing I would say, if you want to improve, if you say, well, RCEP as it was drafted does not focus as much as it should on supply chains in times of crisis, happy for you. UNESCAP, the UN agency for this region, has actually finished a project on trade in times of crisis. They made a handbook, they have courses, they even have a draft chapter on how to handle trade in times of crisis, essential goods, essential services, et cetera, that you could take and stick into RCEP. That would solve many of the crisis kinds of problems that we run into, which is how do we decide what's a crisis, how long it's going to last, what are essential goods and services, how can we be transparent about it. So you could put that in RCEP and quite simply and quickly, I think, solve some of the worries about a new crisis and the coordination necessary. And the third suggestion is that Korea must not miss this opportunity to apply for CPTPP membership. I know this keeps coming on the agenda, but if you actually want to help companies deliver both in times of crisis and not in times of crisis, you must be integrated into high-quality trade agreements that deliver zero tariffs on everything. Every service sector open, every investment sector open, deep commitments. Only the CPTPP gives you that. And there is a window right now for Korea to finally, fingers crossed, make it happen. And I would say if you want to diversify your supply chains, that should be a priority. That's real benefits for companies. And then they can take advantage of what you have provided for them as a framework and actually deliver diversified supply chains. So I think the three suggestions: implement RCEP, put that trade in times of crisis into RCEP if you're worried about it. You could put it in TPP2, but you have to be a member. So the third one, get into CPTPP. And I think those are the ways in which especially the government can assist companies in building those resilient supply chains. Because it's not the government that makes a supply chain, it is the private sector. But the government can create conditions or foster conditions that make it easier. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Korea to do, it's already in, it's already been active, it's been thinking about this, to push that a little bit further.
Thank you for your suggestion. And now Mr. Yu and you both agreed on the potential of cooperation. So our next task will be how to make that potential into reality. So I mean, to our mind, ASEAN is still, we think, when we think about ASEAN is always abundant in natural resources. But so I want to make a question to Minister Lembong that just yesterday or the day before yesterday, I read a very surprising news that Indonesia decided to import Russian oil. Have you read that? Because I thought Indonesia was petroleum export country, but why you need to import? I mean, the volume of production has been decreased, or for any other reason there?
That's correct, Mr. Kim. We have one of the most unfriendly business climate for oil and gas investment in the world. And because of that, for the last 30 years, our oil production has been decreasing steadily. And we turned into a net oil importer maybe around 10 or 15 years ago. And into a net gas importer, maybe like in the last 5 or 7 years. So we have a rapidly expanding energy trade deficit, particularly when it comes to purely hydrocarbons. Yeah, so we've become a bigger and bigger exporter, bigger and bigger producer and exporter of coal. So in terms of our overall energy trade, our huge coal exports are helping quite a bit. We're, of course, by far the largest exporter of palm oil. So to the extent that that is used as biodiesel, that's also an energy export that helps sort of balance the energy trade. But your question brings us to what Ambassador Kim just touched on, which is the geopolitics around all this, around supply chains, right? Reducing dependency on China, energy trade, right? Russian oil. And I think it does raise a question, right? You know, ultimately, economic activity and commerce, ultimately, cannot get away from our question of national identity. What kind of a society do we want to be, right? Going green, reducing carbon emissions, in many respects, now makes a lot of economic sense. Renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuel energy. Yeah. But it's also a social issue, right? Like, we want to be good caretaker of our planet. Like, that is a social and moral issue that resonates more and more with our people, especially our young people. Yeah. So I think you raise a fascinating dimension to all this. So far, we've been talking about supply chains, we've been talking about trade facilitation, you know, in mostly economic terms, right? But there is a social dimension, there is a moral dimension to all this. And personally, I personally would regard Russian oil as blood oil, right? Because the revenues are directly financing Russia's aggression on Ukraine. So I would not take that issue so lightly, the way, sadly, some of my colleagues in the Indonesian government are viewing this as a merely commercial, you know, opportunity. I think what we do, including in trade, expresses who we are, you know, expresses the values we have, right? Which, again, you know, I did touch on this a little bit earlier. You know, anti-corruption, anti-tax evasion is a very big Western preoccupation. But I do think, you know, any country invading another country is a simple moral issue for all countries, you know, East or West. And again, I think we need to be a bit more self-aware and a bit more cognizant of the moral dimensions of trade, right? Like, how polluting, you know, is our trade, or how polluting is our industry, right? How polluting are our supply chains? And then we should do it both because it's good for business to make supply chains more efficient. It's good for society to make supply chains and production more environmentally friendly. It's healthier for the public to have less air pollution, less water pollution, and so on. And there's a moral dimension to all this as well. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lembong. You pointed out a very important issue, moral dimension and social issues. Today we'll not discuss it, but later I really want to organize another seminar on this issue together with trade and commerce. Well, we talked about IPF and also supply chain and potential of cooperation between ASEAN and Korea. Now, the question is how to make it, how to make our cooperation And I want to ask Ambassador Kim first, because he was based in Indonesia, he was recently, and he was involved in bilateral issues with Indonesia, but there is also ASEAN headquarters is also in Jakarta, right? So you met with so many people from ASEAN headquarters. So what is your idea how to promote cooperation between ASEAN and Korea in supply chains?
Well, let me just touch upon briefly what Dr. Adams has mentioned earlier. I'm basically in full agreement with what Dr. Adams has suggested as policy options for the Korean government. Especially, I think that Korea has a very unique standing. It has extremely extensive trade networks within regional and multilateral trading system. Partly thanks to Minister Yu and her colleagues' efforts in recent years. We have bilateral FTA with every IPEF member states except Japan and Fiji, right? Yes. And we belong to RCEP, and I think that we have expressed our willingness to join CPTPP. And we are now still conducting a trilateral FTA amongst China, Japan, and Korea, even though the process has been dragged on with very little results. So I think this quite uniquely extensive trade networks that South Korea is enjoying at this moment can be a good asset. And as was mentioned by Dr. Adams, we should accelerate our efforts to extensively implement our trade agreements. And another element that is related with Minister Kim's question, we have to join hands with partners that include ASEAN, whether it's capacity building, technical assistance, know-how sharing, and even infrastructure building. For our companies and for our private business sector players to have more secure, stable, and robust supply chain networks. So we have to invest in order to have closer and well-coordinated network with those ASEAN partners. Lastly, I think there's one issue that is now emerging as a matter of kind of urgency is critical minerals. We have identified choke points within our supply chain, mostly product-based. Now, the issue is going down to minerals and rare earths. Critical minerals comprise around 20, 30 items like cobalt, nickel, rare earths, lithiums, and others. Those are critical elements for high-tech industries and products. Renewable energies, batteries, semiconductors, you name it. Without those critical minerals, especially, we are overly dependent on imports of those critical minerals from China. So how we could solve these problems is just ahead of us. I think for that, we may have to come up with new solutions and new ideas and new consultation mechanism together with ASEAN partners, especially Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Without those efforts, I think we may be entrapped into very difficult positions in a very near future.
Thank you. Mr. Yu, if anything to add to Ambassador Kim's suggestion?
I would also like to pick up from his very valuable points. First, regarding the FTAs, FTAs are actually living documents. They are the written agreements, but there are, for example, cooperation chapter that we can further add many valuable projects and can implement various projects based on the written documents. So between Korea and ASEAN, there is a Korea-ASEAN FTA, but there is individual agreement between the individual members, like Korea, Indonesia, SEPA, Korea, Singapore digital trade agreement, but Korea, Philippines trade FTA agreement, and Korea-Cambodia agreement, Korea-Vietnam FTA agreement, in addition to ICEP. So on top of accelerating our implementation, we can also add many valuable cooperation projects as a part of our implementation. So I hope that we can faithfully implement those individual as well as regional trade agreements between the two sides. In addition to implementing our FTA projects, FTA agreements, I would like to also emphasize the importance of expanding our supply resilience cooperation into future strategic industries. He mentioned critical minerals. Minister Kim mentioned the urea's case. When Korea had difficulty in our heavy independence on China for urea material, we later had an MOU with first Indonesia and then later Vietnam, and now we have stabilized our urea sourcing after concluding our MOUs with the two countries respectively. But we shouldn't stop there. Urea is critical mineral or raw material, but we should also expand our cooperation into emerging strategic industries like EVs, electric vehicles. So nowadays, Hyundai motor companies, they established electric vehicle factories there, and also LG Energy Solutions also established their battery companies there. And for example, Hyundai also established R&D center, innovation center in Singapore to test business mobility there for future cars. So we could use whole ecosystem across the region in ASEAN. So we could use ecosystem throughout the ASEAN region in future automobile systems there. So in regard to our cooperation in supply chains, we could expand our cooperation into more forward-looking future industries as well. And I would like to also make more broader points about our supply chain cooperations. This is more, our some sort of recommendation on our future cooperation in supply chain resilience, and also these are a bit of repetition of the points that Ambassador Kim actually mentioned before. In regard to our cooperation on supply chains, I'd like to highlight the 2 points. Supply chain resilience or supply chain cooperations, at the end of the day, the decisions are made at private sector company levels. Whether it is a government-to-government corporations or whether it is our negotiations at the IPEF, supply chain resilience comes at a price. It requires sometimes stockpiling or reshoring or multiple sourcing. That comes at a price. So at the end of the day, it requires private companies' decision making with a price. So we need very close consultation with private sector companies. So in government-to-government consultation with between Korea and ASEAN or in IPF consultations, it is important to have a participation from private sector so that we can reflect what is happening actually and also what are needed on the ground. That is very important point. And second point is that I think, these days we are also witnessing some sort of protectionism in the name of supply chain resilience. So it is important to keep in mind that we should not, we should be very careful so that supply chain resilience serve its proper purpose without sliding into protectionism. So between Korea and ASEAN, when we work together for the supply chain resilience, we should work together because this region has achieved its economic success based on our openness to trade and investment. And at least for this region, we should work together to keep it that way so that we should be careful not to slide into protectionism, but to achieve our supply chain resilience based on openness to trade and investment. So in working together, we should keep that in mind as a principle. So I just like to highlight that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Minister
Yu.
Kim, if I may jump in.
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
Because I feel so compelled by my fellow panelists' comments. But starting with Minister Yu's extremely important point just now, that we have to actively educate the public that resilience is not the same as self-sufficiency. Yeah. So actually, in many cases, driving towards self-sufficiency weakens your supply chains, makes you more vulnerable, right? And we had a dramatic illustration of this. The United States recently had a crisis with baby formula, baby food. And the USA is actually self-sufficient in baby food. But the problem is that the US was relying entirely on its domestic supply chain for baby formula. On top of that, there was excessive concentration in the industry. So the entire crisis started because only one single large factory of one company, namely Abbott, was forced to shut down, and it suddenly caused a nationwide shortage of baby formula. It was only solved when they finally were able to import baby formula. If I remember correctly, it was from Singapore, actually, right? So actually, the very important point Minister Yu raises is that the solution for enhancing resilience is greater interdependence, like smart interdependence, being able to help each other out when we have failures in our respective supply chains. But she's so right that many policymakers or more nationalistic or sort of protectionist elements say, oh, we have to rely less on imports. That is actually the worst thing you can do, right? And then to Dr. Elm's point, it's definitely true. ASEAN still has a very long way to go in matching China's efficiency in logistics, in building the ecosystems, like the supporting industries and the whole clusters, right? But there's a positive example of success on that front, which is Samsung Electronics in Vietnam, where I believe over the years, Samsung has built up from end to end, from the basic materials to the components, to the packaging, to the labeling, everything, end to end. And I believe just Samsung Electronics now accounts for like 40% of Vietnam's entire exports. But it's such a competitive export base for Samsung Electronics now, Vietnam. But that shows that, Korean companies can do it. They can literally replicate a little Shenzhen in Vietnam, and we'll need more of that. And lastly, I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate our Korean colleagues here, Ministers Kim and you and Ambassador Kim, because Korea has just been wonderfully successful in ASEAN. I think it's something to be celebrated. And it's something that should give us courage. And it's a momentum we can continue to build on, to make ASEAN at least a partial solution to reducing, and indeed it is impossible to eliminate, but we can reduce our over-dependency on China. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I must confess that we heard only from two Koreans from Korean perspective, and that's why I would like to ask ASEAN perspective, because we should not be nationalistic or or self-sufficiency or like that. So thank you for telling us your precious view. And lastly, Dr. Adams, how about from ASEAN perspective again? You already made some suggestions for us, but how to strengthen cooperation between ASEAN and Korea, not only in supply chain, for whole economy and trade as well.
So I think the example that Minister Lembong just made about the Samsung plant is an interesting one, because on the one hand, aren't we delighted, actually, A, that Samsung has been so successful, and B, that Vietnam has done so well in capitalizing on that. But if we're talking about supply chain dependency, if 40% of your exports depend on one company, that's a bit alarming, right? Like, that's the same problem, only in a sort of different format. So I think it's great, and again, I'm delighted. But I also think rather than make Samsung do an end-to-end supply chain, wouldn't it be great if we had other, especially Vietnamese companies, that were part of that, more part of that supply chain? Rather than doing it all in-house, you had a network that could work with companies besides just Samsung, but so they're not completely tied to one firm, but could supply for others. We're seeing that develop now, I think, in Vietnam in particular, driven by the success and given the capacity now that has grown up around many of the suppliers in that chain. They have the ability to participate with other non-Samsung companies, which is great. That's what you want. But there is that transition, I think, can be difficult. From having no capacity to having firms that come in and invest, which is, again, what ASEAN has wanted all along, to build those skills and transfer some technology either directly or indirectly, and then have the ecosystem start to develop. But it's also a bit threatening, and I think this is a challenge that you see repeatedly in ASEAN, is that when the beginning of that stage can feel a bit threatening, as the foreign firms come in, and they come in especially foreign talent, come in with foreign talent, foreign money, and they develop something that is seen as deeply threatening. And at a time of economic headwinds, that is really tough for politicians to sort of stand firm and say, no, we need to allow this to happen. And then move from the inbound investment to the creation of that ecosystem, which is also great. But then the final stage, which is to take that ecosystem and make it more locally supportive of other kind of sectors, that's also very alarming and hard to do. That transition is very difficult. And so I think for ASEAN, it needs to remember, and I think I'm delighted to be on this particular panel, it's been refreshing, remember that that process, which feels very painful and feels very difficult, ultimately is what helps you grow and develop. And you see that over and over again in Asia, for sure. Certainly sitting here in Korea, you've seen that same trajectory. And I hope that the ASEAN countries can remember that that was the point behind this whole integration platform in the first place. You know, ASEAN's been at this now for decades. And it's hard in times of economic pressure to stay strong. And so I would hope that Korea can help its ASEAN members recall what the point was. Why is this so vital for us? Why is it vital for Korea? Why does it matter to the region? And then ultimately, why does it matter to the larger globe, I suppose? You know, that you can't get where you want to go if you're not willing to accept a certain amount of discomfort, pain, and potential cost, but that there's a point behind it. And the point is to develop those skills, talents, and to continue to move. In this case, it's not so much up the value chain, but to move society along to the point where you are developing competitive companies at all scales and all levels and in all sectors.
Thank you. Already we spent much of our time, and now we have only 5 minutes now. So I will open the floor to the audience. If there is question, anybody who wants to make a question to our panels, even to Minister Lembong by online, you can make a question. No questions at all? That means our panels explained so well, so it's quite easily understood, so you don't need to make any questions to that. Okay, then, even though we have 5 minutes, I decided to close this session, and I really thank you for our panels and Mr. Lembong, and thank you for all the audience and participation in this session. Thank you so much. Yeah.